Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to talk about the era of good feelings, the period of so-called political unity that emerged after the War of 1812. So, looks pretty neat. Here are our objectives for today. Make sure you clearly understand them, and then we'll dive into our narrative. So, where we last left the United States, we had just won the War of 1812, and this really served as the death knell for the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party had been losing strength and losing influence for years. It had a brief sort of resurgence over the whole conflict with England and the War of 1812 specifically, but the Federalist Party didn't have much life left in it. The death of Alexander Hamilton sapped a lot of the vitality out of the Federalists, and for the most part, they didn't have many politicians who were coming up with new and different ideas, and so this really prevented them from bringing in new followers. And the Hartford Convention really made the Federalists appear both pro-British, pro-monarchy, and anti-American. The idea that on the verge, right as the war was about to be won, quote-unquote, by the United States, that the Federalists would consider allying with England made them appear to be some sort of apparently monarchical devil or something. So, yeah, you clearly don't want to be associated with that, and that's going to lead to the Federalist Party, for the most part, dying out. As we can see here, the Federalists had been losing significant influence going forward, and their numbers in the aftermath of the War of 1812 are going to drop down to almost nothing, eventually to completely dwindling away. And so this is going to lead to a period of Republican dominance, but the same issues that had divided the country before are going to continue to divide the country. And so whether or not this was actually a period of political unity, I'll leave for you guys to draw conclusions about. The War of 1812 exposed the fact that our infrastructure was more or less non-existent. We were unable to follow up either our victory at the Battle of the Thames or our burning of York due to a lack of logistics. We had almost no roads, we had very few canals, and without, except for navigating rivers, it was extremely difficult for the citizens of the United States to travel around and to ship goods. And so in the aftermath of war, we more or less decided that we need to connect the country together better. We're going to need to dig some canals. We're going to need to build some roads. We're going to need to spend some time investing in infrastructure. Infrastructure, as anyone who's taken economics knows, is a public good. And depending on the private markets and free markets to build infrastructure is a way to get very, very inconsistent infrastructure. And so in general, the federal government is going to have to build infrastructure if it's going to happen. Here we see Timothy Pickering's speech on internal improvements. Quote, "As everybody knows how much cheaper and safer and more expeditious is land transportation over good roads than bad ones, why should the inland inhabitants be denied advantage which none hesitate to grant the borders on the great waters? Commerce is the exchange of commodities and is necessary to be carried out on land as well as water, where canals shall be added to good roads, the facilities and cheapness of the interior commerce among the several states will be proportionately increased." James Madison argues against this. So the power to regulate commerce amongst the several states cannot include a power to construct roads and canals and to improve the navigation of watercourses. To refer the power in question to provide for the common defense and general welfare would be contrary to the established and consistent rules of interpretation. So Madison is for the most part going to be against it, and in the aftermath of the war, it's going to fall to state governments to start building this infrastructure, although the federal government will eventually get involved with this whole thing. The other issue is the Bank of the United States. The federal government, or the Madison administration, let the bank lapse in 1913 after its sort of 20-year charter was up. And so all of that money is then going to go away. And it's going to be very difficult for the United States to pay its debts, pay soldiers, standardize currency, do any of those sort of things. And so here's our triumvirate: Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun discussing the problem of the bank as the bank vomits out money. And so Madison is going to say, quote, "Although the embarrassments arising from the want of a uniform national currency have not been diminished since the adjourning of Congress, great satisfaction has been derived in the contemplating of the revival of public credit and the efficiency of the public resources." So the Madison administration, seeing again the necessity of the national bank, recharters the bank, and we get the second Bank of the United States. Unfortunately, they don't have someone like Hamilton to set up this second bank, and the second bank of the United States was never as effective as the first bank in regulating currency or dealing with economic issues. And so, this bank is going to remain somewhat controversial. It's got a 20-year charter, just like the first bank, and will have to be renewed sometime before 1836, although we'll tell that story in a future lesson. The state of Maryland attempts to tax the bank out of existence, placing a law in place, putting massive taxes on any organization that was not chartered within Maryland. This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and in the case McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court establishes that the Bank of the United States does not have to pay the tax, and that states cannot tax federal organizations out of existence. So it reaffirms the supremacy of the federal government and establishes the constitutionality of the national bank. So that's no longer in question with McCulloch v. Maryland. For the election of 1816, James Madison chooses not to run for a third term because two-term precedent established by Washington. So we've got James Monroe. We see again a return to much closer to what we saw in 1804, with Republican dominance sweeping across the country, some small holdouts in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Delaware, but in general, most people are voting for Democratic Republicans, and so James Monroe becomes President of the United States. James Monroe's main accomplishments are a series of foreign treaties. His Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who was, of course, the diplomatic whiz behind the Treaty of Ghent. He's also going to negotiate these foreign treaties, and he's going to be sort of Monroe's foreign policy whiz. So we're going to, in the Rush-Bagot Agreement, we're going to establish the northern border of the United States at the 49th parallel. We're going to establish a 10-year joint occupation of Oregon country by the United States and Great Britain, which is going to be renewed in perpetuity. And we're going to demilitarize the Great Lakes for once and for all. And so this establishes that our border with Canada is not going to be a militarized, defended border, but instead is going to be the happy, peaceful thing that it is today. The more problematic issue was Florida and Spain. So, Andrew Jackson, in fighting a group of Seminoles, Jackson is constantly leading militia against various Native American tribes who are threatening, supposedly, the territory of the United States. And so, Jackson is going to fight against the Seminoles, and the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, gave him orders to, quote, adopt necessary measures to neutralize the Seminoles. And, of course, as we know from the Elastic Clause, necessary measures is kind of a broad statement open to interpretation. So Jackson decided to instead invade Florida. He invaded Florida, defeated the Seminole Raiders, capturing their chiefs along with 2 English citizens. Jackson then court-martialed and hanged both British citizens and had moved to Fort Pensacola, capturing the capital of Spanish Florida and occupying it by the United States. Quote, although Monroe and Adams later disclaimed Jackson's actions, they did not punish him, nor did they return the huge prize of his warfare, namely all of Florida, nor did Congress censure him for usurping its constitutional war powers. So, the Transcontinental Treaty was signed to legalize Jackson's fait accompli, his invasion of Florida, his capture of the Spanish government there, and his execution of 2 British subjects, which should have created a massive international incident. But in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, no one really wanted to jump into warfare again. So we're all just going to sweep this under the rug, pretend it didn't happen, but now we get Florida because of the Adams-Onis Treaty. So the Spanish cede Florida to us, which admittedly they had literally very little choice. Jackson had already taken it. We were going to give the Spanish some territory in Louisiana, and we're going to establish these boundaries, the Arkansas and Red River boundaries and the 42nd parallel between the territory of New Spain, which is still which is going to be controlled by Spain for the next year or two before it eventually becomes the independent country of Mexico. But that's a story for another time. For the election of 1820, this is our true era of good feelings elections. We haven't seen an election like this since 1792. James Monroe gets all the electoral votes with the exception of one faithless elector who votes for John Quincy Adams for reasons known only to that person. So, Monroe is elected unanimously in 1820. The Federalist Party is, for all intents and purposes, dead, and everyone is a Democratic Republican. In the aftermath of this wonderful victory, Monroe is going to issue the Monroe Doctrine. As I just mentioned, Spain is going to lose all of its North American colonies through the Latin American Wars of Independence. Hopefully you remember from your world history classes the adventures of Padre Miguel Hidalgo, Agustin Iturbide, Vicente Guerrero, Simón Bolívar, and José de San Martín. If not, there's some world history lectures that you should probably go back and watch. But we're concerned that European countries, specifically maybe England or possibly Prussia or maybe France, are going to try to reoccupy these newly independent states. And so we issue what's called the Monroe Doctrine, which states that European countries should not interfere with the colonization or should not interfere with these new republics and should not try to seize new colonies in the Americas. We, of course, at this point have absolutely zero ability to defend these countries. We have a limited navy. Our army is nowhere near large enough to fight off any real assault by a European power. But this states a precedent which we later will then enforce. So the Monroe Doctrine establishes the supremacy of the United States over the American continents, telling Europeans and others to stay the heck out. John Quincy Adams here, quote, "It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political systems to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition with any form of indifference. Namely, if you take colonies in the Americas, we're going to have something to say about it." And that's literally all we can do as of right now. We're also going to see with the clearing out of Native Americans a massive boom of westward expansion and population growth. The population of the United States is going to start increasing substantially in the next couple decades. And so whereas in 1800 our population is about 5 million, we're getting close to 10 million by 1820, and then increasing substantially each few years after this. And so we're going to see substantial population growth and economic growth, leading to the development of the first industrial revolution in the United States. But that's a story for tomorrow. The Marshall Court is also going to continue to affirm Federalist principles. Despite the fact that the Federalists have vanished from all other branches of government, John Marshall is still ostensibly a Federalist, and so he's going to continue to uphold the fact that federal law is over state law, that the bank is constitutional, that the elastic clause is a thing that can be used. He's going to continue to support broad construction and make sure that these principles laid out by Alexander Hamilton stay enshrined in federal law and federal policy. So the Supreme Court continues to maintain Federalist principles despite the fact that they've vanished from everywhere else in government. That brings us to the end of our quote-unquote era of good feelings. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail, and when we come back, we'll talk about the economic growth of the United States, and we're going to move into an era called the Market Revolution. Thank you for listening.